Good afternoon. I'm Cayco from ADB's Department of Communications. Today, ADB is launching a new report, Southeast Asia Rising from the Pandemic. On behalf of ADB, I'd like to thank all the media who are with us today, as well as all the others who attended. This new report provides a snapshot of Southeast Asia's economic recovery as the region emerges from COVID-19 and highlights several key policy measures that can help countries accelerate the recovery in a sustainable manner. The report's main author, James Villafuerte, is with us today, along with the Director General of ADB's Southeast Asia Department, Ramesh Subramaniam. After Ramesh and James present the key findings of the new study, we'll be opening up the floor for your questions. You can submit your questions via the chat box on your screen. Please do include your name and media outfit. We'll be concluding today's session at 1 p.m. Manila time, after which Ramesh will be holding a quick fireside chat with Nikkei Asia, which you are all welcome to attend. With that, I'm happy to introduce Ramesh Subramaniam. Ramesh, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jam. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm joining from a morning time zone, but I'm sure there are a number of you with over 7,000 people registered for this two-day Southeast Asia Development Symposium 2022. Many of you are in different time zones. A very, very warm welcome to all of you to the launch of a new ADB report, as Jam mentioned, Southeast Asia Rising from the Pandemic. The timing of this report, I would say, is quite auspicious in the midst of all the gloom and doom and uncertainties that we are facing, because we do see signs of optimism, and we do believe that there is a lot of hopefulness. More than 2 years after the COVID-19 pandemic that has swept through Southeast Asia, as well as the rest of the world, upending lives, creating job losses, impeding economic growth, we are finally seeing lots and lots of reasons, I would say. Let me just mention a few. Southeast Asia ended 2021 with solid signs of economic recovery as vaccination rates picked up. It was enormously challenging to get vaccines to the region, but the countries have done really well. Economies opened up and growth turned positive. Although Omicron clearly triggered new waves of COVID-19 infections, the majority of the cases, luckily, were mild or moderate, and thankfully deaths and hospitalizations have remained relatively low in comparison with what we saw in 2020. Borders are also starting to reopen. People are beginning to venture out again. Many of us are out traveling with visits to also retail and recreational areas in Southeast Asia, which is actually very, very important given how critical tourism has been in the region prior to the pandemic. All these flows, visits have risen by 160% over a 2-year period, ending just a month ago in February 2022. While these developments are all quite positive, encouraging, recovery unfortunately remains fraught with difficulties and uncertainties. First, 2022 output levels are unfortunately expected to remain well below the no COVID baseline level. At the same time, we've got increasing trade tensions, geopolitical conflict, as well as what we are seeing, Russian invasion of Ukraine could derail prospects for recovery. Second, the path to economic recovery remains uneven. Economies with widespread technology adoption, resilient merchandise exports, a base of good natural resources and greater space are expected to recover faster. However, those economies that rely on tourism or largely services sector have a large informal sector and highly concentrated growth drivers with low levels of economic diversification will unfortunately continue to struggle. This divergence could erode the efforts that are taken by countries to narrow development gaps. Third, probably most critically, the pandemic has already reversed many hard-won gains in reducing poverty and particularly inequality. The study that James will be presenting a bit later notes the number of people living in extreme poverty in Southeast Asia, those living on less than $1.90 a day, rose by 5.3 million in 2020 relative to the no pandemic scenario. And unfortunately, in 2021, we saw another 4.7 million falling below into this threshold compared to a no-COVID scenario. And the pandemic has unfortunately had a disproportionate impact on the urban poor, given the concentration of workers in the informal sectors, and particularly and worryingly, women and children from low-income households. I hope a lot of you joined the previous panel where some of these issues were picked up. And in fact, I was remarking to my colleagues that some of these numbers, trends, stories that you hear are all quite heart-wrenching. But in the midst, as I said at the beginning, in the midst of all these challenges that we face, we do believe countries in Southeast Asia particularly are well positioned to go forward with a number of policy actions, other reform measures to address these challenges. First, more resources need to be allocated for health systems to deepen the reforms, the investments that countries had made prior to the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic in the last 2 years, much has gone into communicable diseases, and countries need to now go more for universal health coverage. The benefits are significant. What James will be presenting, what the report picks up, is that an uptick in health spending could actually have remarkable impact on overall GDP growth. Second, countries need to pursue a range of structural reforms. Almost every single country in the region, any policymaker that you speak to, have said very clearly that this crisis, like the past crisis, or an opportunity to unleash structural reforms. And we see many efforts on this front to boost competitiveness, to boost productivity, to invest more in education, which is actually going to be very, very critical. And third, I would say the point that I'd like to share, this is a timeless classic type of point, that policymakers do need to strengthen macroeconomic fundamentals. You can never go wrong by strengthening continuously macroeconomic fundamentals, and particularly fiscal prudence needs to be maintained because fiscal consolidation is going to be a reality, not an exception. And while there are enduring challenges that predated COVID that would still be there, that needs to be addressed. For example, Southeast Asia, as well as many countries in Asia and the Pacific, remain quite highly vulnerable to climate change, natural hazards and disasters. And we also have, prior to the pandemic, the CO2 emissions were quite high. The pandemic did help cut these emissions by about less than 6% in 2020. But more recent data show that by mid-2021, global fossil fuel carbon emissions are already picking up, or in fact, actually to higher than 2019 levels. And in this context, regional and global CO2 emissions must be reduced. But at the same time, as I said, crises do create opportunities. As countries emerge from the pandemic, it's imperative that they don't return to business as usual. They need to place themselves on a solid path to green recovery by putting in place policies that encourage the switch to cleaner fuels and that protect rivers and oceans, promote biodiversity, going to be very critical. Public and private sectors need to work much more closely together, well, in general, as well as to fight the challenges posed by climate change. In a recent tweet, American poet and activist Amanda Gorman exhorted humanity to continue hoping, living, loving, trying. To continue hoping, living, loving, trying. The most human thing we can do at any given time is dare to believe beyond disaster. Daring to believe is what has sustained us for the past 2 years. Now that we finally seem to be turning a corner, we need to bolster that belief with concrete action. We owe it to ourselves and future generations to transcend routine and build back greener and better. With that, thank you so much, and back to you, Jam.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. To discuss the key points of the report, let's hear from its main author, ADB Senior Economist James Villafuerte. James, over to you.
Thank you, Jam. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. The Southeast Asia Rising from the Pandemic report is an annual report of the Southeast Asia Regional Department. This is the second report, but the first one to be published. And we are really quite happy because this comes at a time when the region is recovering in terms of economic indicators. But one thing that I would like to note is that when you look at the development indicators, the recovery is actually much lagging. Next slide, please. So we have three key messages from this report. I think first one really is, next slide, please. The first one really is that the development impact of the pandemic is really quite unprecedented. Many workers have lost their jobs, and many have actually been de-skilled because they haven't been working for over 2 years. And even with this economic recovery, our expectation is that many will have difficulty finding a job. And the worry actually is if this happens, this development impact, increased poverty and inequality can actually cross generations and could last longer. And we know from our development economics that poverty inequality is a bane to growth. In particular, inequality destroys work incentives for those workers who are working in sectors that are not recovering at all, like for example, tourism sectors, accommodation, hospitality. It also impairs the ability of poor households to send their kids to school, thereby affecting the future welfare of younger generations. And more worrisome is actually poverty and inequality destroys the foundation for social cohesion and growth. That's why this is really one of the strong message of the report, that we need to do more to ensure that this development outcome is mitigated. The second message from the report is that in terms of economic indicators, as Ramesh mentioned, we are really seeing a slow but good recovery. Ramesh has mentioned the statistics on mobility. When we look, for example, at manufacturing production in the region where there is data, all countries' manufacturing production, the manufacturing PMI, are all in expansionary phase. This is actually in contrast to the last 2 years when most of these manufacturing activities are actually contracting. But the story is quite uneven, and it also depends on what we expect about the path of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we are seeing is that the pandemic actually discriminates. No? So economies that have strong manufacturing sectors, those that are endowed with natural resources like oil and other minerals, those that boast of large remittances, have large fiscal space, and therefore were able to pursue a strong vaccination campaign. Those that are digitally enabled are actually recording better prospects. On the other hand, economies in the region that are more dependent on hospitality and tourism, those that have larger informal sector, those that have narrow growth drivers, are still facing some challenges. As Ramesh mentioned, the output level in the region still remains well below the no-COVID scenario. But what's more worrying is when we try to incorporate the risk factors into the baseline projection. So one of the risk factors is that we will see more COVID-19 variants and we will see more COVID-19 waves. So if we factor in at least 2 waves that could disrupt activities for 2 quarters in 2022, what we are seeing actually is that the outlook for 2022, as we predicted in December last year, could be 0.8 percentage point lower. So this is actually quite large because this is about almost a 1/6 of our growth projection. Next slide, please. The last message is despite this worry or concerns, there are so many reasons for optimism. And one is really the concerted effort that we are seeing across all governments in the region to build stronger and to build a greener economy. There are 6 policy interventions, and I think the first 3 are actually addressing weakness in human welfare and human development. So the first policy priority is really to increase the investment in health and to fortify national health system so that we are ready to cope with the pandemic. This is not the last, but just the first. And as Bill Gates said, he is worried that another one is just around the corner. We saw many sectors and many workers lost their jobs and lost their source of income. And I think even with fiscal space narrowing, the need to continue priority spending, providing for social assistance will be there because of the large impact on the poor and the vulnerable. And of course, the first and foremost priority for the region is really how to create jobs and to boost labor market. And we are seeing a lot of movement in terms of sectoral jobs. And workers cannot just easily transition from one sector to the other because the skills requirements are so different. So we also need to raise the quality of education and training to prepare our workers for the future. The next three policy priorities are actually those that are aimed to enhance the competitiveness and productivity of the economy. We know that MSMEs comprise around 80 to 90% of employment and value added in the region. And I think what we saw during the pandemic is that firms that are able to go online, that are able to access technology, actually fare better in the pandemic. So I think we need to actually increase the capability and increase the access to devices and technology by our MSME. Easing the transport barriers and trade barriers, investing in logistics and distribution center, and improving competitiveness will be needed to boost the productivity, because what this shock did is it actually increased the cost of production because we have to worry about physical distancing. Last but not the least, as Ramesh mentioned, we are not just economic leaders, but we are also stewards of our planet. And we need to find new ways of working in new areas, forging partnership between public and private sector, and pooling funds to ensure that we cut our carbon emission and build a global economy. Next slide, please. So this is the deep development impact that we are seeing in the report. And prior to the pandemic, one story is that poverty in the region, extreme poverty in terms of those household individuals that are consuming less than $1.9 a day, they have been declining since 2017. For example, in 2017, 21.2 million people are living below $1.9 a day. But by 2019, it's gone down to already 14.2 million. And without COVID, those living under extreme poverty would have fallen by another 1.1 million to 13.1 million. But what COVID did was it increased the number of people living in extreme poverty to 18.4 or 5.4 million people, higher than what it would have been without COVID. And then another 4.7 million people are also falling into extreme poverty in 2021 compared to the 2020 no COVID policy. So these impacts are actually quite worrying, because it can actually be the source of scarring. And much of this impact is arising from the large unemployment or jobs losses, which average about 10 million a year relative to the no COVID baseline in 2020 and 2021. The other worrying thing, although we don't have actually good data, is expected increase in inequality. So the World Bank did a rapid survey of inequality based on their own perception. And what they found out is that, for example, if you look at the indicator of the share of the top to bottom quintile income ratio, it's deteriorated by 2.2%. In terms of the Gini deteriorated by 1%. So it seems to appear that actually the short-term impact of the pandemic on inequality is actually quite modest. But I think there are confounding factors that could actually increase the inequality impact in the long run. This is really why we are hammering the message that we need to mitigate the impact to ensure that this doesn't cross generations. Next slide, please. So what we did in the report as well is to try to track to see where we are now compared to where we could have been without the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we are seeing is across the region, the deviation of actual growth levels to the expected growth trend is actually quite large. On average, at least it's 10% on average between 2020 and 2021. And one reason is that prior to the pandemic, the region is really growing very fast. For example, ASEAN as a group is growing at 5.3% annually in the last 10 years. And what we saw in 2020 is that the region actually contracted by 4%. So some countries that are growing very fast, like for example, Philippines was growing on average by 6.4% a year, or for example, Cambodia was growing on average at 7% a year. Of course, when they face COVID, the output gap that resulted is actually quite large. And this is worrying because although in growth numbers we are seeing a rebound from negative to positive growth, a part of this, a large part of this is the base effect. That's why we need to look at the level differential between the expected output without COVID and the actual output. So I think we really need to do more to ensure that we recover the losses that has been there, that has accumulated over the last 2 years. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, one problem with economic forecasts is they have recency bias. Usually, they use only available data. So if we are doing our forecast now, usually we look at the data in December and January and make a judgment on what will be the forecast. And some of our worries we put into the risk factor. So what we've done in the report is actually we asked the question, what if we include some of those risk factors in the baseline projection? What would be the impact on growth? So one risk factor was the volatility of COVID. So we said, let's examine the case where we see about 2 more waves of COVID, which is actually much smaller and much shorter, that could affect economic disruptions. And let's see what will be the impact on growth. And what we see is that it's quite substantial. It's still 0.8 percentage point of growth in 2022. And for some countries, it's even larger than 1%. And I think what this shows us is that while growth are actually rebounding from negative to positive, the volatility around this is actually quite large. And that's why we need to really prioritize some policies, specifically in terms of investing in health and fortifying our health system. In the study, we also did an optimistic scenario where we assume that the countries in the region allocates more resources to invest in health system and fortify their health and enhance their capacity to respond to the pandemic. And we do this by increasing their health expenditure to about 5%. So presently, prior to the pandemic, the average expenditure for health in the region is about 3%. And what we see in this optimistic scenario is that the growth in the region in 2022 could actually increase by 1.5 percentage point higher. And for almost all the economies, they're actually growing at least 1% higher. So what this communicates to us is that it's really quite important that we don't disregard investing money in healthcare system, because they do pay in terms of economic growth. Next slide, please. The report also covers 8 country chapters, and in the first 2 chapters was the chapter for Indonesia and the chapter for the Philippines. And in these 2 chapters, the theme of economic scoring was covered. If you know, in Indonesia, there was some modest disruptions in economic activity, but because of prompt fiscal response and strong monetary and financial policy, the authorities in Indonesia prompted a deeper downturn. However, Indonesia is still seeing a drop in investments, rising unemployment, and also mild contraction in productivity. But we are quite hopeful that Indonesia's productivity gains can actually be sustained. And what they need to do is really to harness the potential of the digital technology, and they should also implement structural reform to invest in skills, invest in infrastructure, as well as raise private sector participation in investment. Second slide, please. The other country that tackled the theme of economic scoring is in the Philippines. In the Philippines, we saw a large disruption in the labor market, and this is basically due to the reallocation of jobs across sectors and the rise of informal jobs. So presently, unemployment rate still remains above long-term trend. So in 2020, in the Philippines, unemployment doubled to over 10% from 5.1% in 2019. Presently, unemployment in the Philippines is around 6.6%, but it's still higher than the long-term trend. And the policy priorities that are important to really ensure that we create jobs and avert this labor market disruption is to strengthen enterprise-led training, emphasize the importance of industry board, and also industry-led apprenticeship. We should also incorporate active labor market policy in our unemployment insurance to ensure that workers have the incentives to work. And we also need to invest in reskilling and upskilling, because there are so many jobs that have arisen, and they also need more training for our new entrants and those that lost job to be ready to be employed. Next slide, please. The next three chapters in the book actually talk about the shifts in economic drivers, and one country that we have seen where the shift in economic driver is happening is actually in Cambodia. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that the pandemic hit the traditional growth drivers in Cambodia from tourism, garments, real estate, and construction. They were actually quite significantly affected. Now that Cambodia is recovering, what we are seeing is that the agricultural sector is actually taking the lead with their exports of bananas and other fruits. Non-manufacturing activities are also increasing, which incorporates the production of auto parts, the production of electrical parts, bicycles. And in particular, I think the enhancement in agricultural production in Cambodia is partly related to its recently signed free trade agreement with the China as well as Korea. So this provide Cambodia with a large export market for its agricultural product. We are also seeing in Cambodia an increase in inflow in FDI sectors in, for example, pharmaceuticals, solar technology, and we think that these new growth drivers can actually help Cambodia recover from the pandemic. Next slide, please. The other two chapters in the region talks about Laos, PDR, and also Thailand. And then for these two countries, the main challenge is actually the impact of the pandemic in the tourism sector. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that the Lao economy is really trying to diversify its source, and one of the areas that it's actually targeting is actually the tourism sector. The Lao is also emphasizing the increased use of digitization to enhance its ability to produce. However, as we saw during the last 2 years, the pandemic has caused a great strain on the economic growth of Lao, and GDP growth is not expected actually to exceed 4% in the next 2 years. The most important, I think, for Lao PDR is it needs to pursue transformative reform agenda, in particular to improve the efficiency of business services by streamlining regulations and also minimizing the cost of opening business and also licensing. They also need to focus more on business development as well as developing products across the supply chain, and investment and regulatory environment needs to be also simplified. Next slide, please. For Thailand, the focus in Thailand is actually, as Ramesh mentioned, tourism is a very important part of the region, and one of the top tourist destinations in the region is actually Thailand. For Thailand, tourism accounts for about 20% of employment as well as about 20% of contribution to GDP, and that's why if you look at the growth projection for Thailand, they were actually significantly affected by the pandemic because it's really the hospitality and tourism sector that were affected. So I think in the short term, as Ramesh already mentioned, we need to support the tourism sector to ensure that tourism small businesses can stay afloat and ride this economic crisis. We also need to refocus our attention to more domestic tourism and short-haul tourism, including interregional tourism, because expectation is that long-haul tourism or tourism coming from Europe and America will not be coming back to the region probably until late 2024. As Ramesh mentioned, I think the key priority is to ensure a safe reopening and return of tourism, incorporating vaccine data, health data, as well as managing the tourism lane is a key priority. And we are seeing to date, we are seeing that a number of our countries in the region are opening up. In the medium term, I think the priority is really to support a green and digital transition of tourism, also to focus more on the high-end tourism, not the mass tourism, and to incorporate tourism in the spatial planning of the country. Next slide, please. Just to wrap up, in the last chapter, we are focusing on Vietnam. And one of the key priority of the Vietnam authorities is really to focus on digital transformation. And if you look at the digital transformation in Vietnam, they've already strengthened their legal and regulatory rules. They've already strengthened applications of technology in terms of financial inclusion. And I think these are expected to improve the prospects for Vietnam. In the low digitalization scenario in the Vietnam chapter, they were thinking that growth could actually increase by 0.4 percentage point. In the high scenario for digitalization, GDP growth of Vietnam could actually increase by 1.35 percentage point. Thank you for your attention, and I end my presentation here. The next slide shows you, I think, our publication, including the QR code where you can actually find the link. Thank you, Jam.
Thank you, James. Excellent presentation. If anyone has questions, please type them in the chat box and include your name and media outfit. We've already received a few, so I'm going to read the first one. On page 25 of the report, it states that Singapore will be the least affected in case of a pessimistic scenario of high COVID-19 cases in 2022 and a policy of higher health spending. Could we check with ADB on whether there are any reasons why this is so? This is from Rosalind Ang. Who would like to answer this one?
James, you're muted. Your mic is muted.
Okay. As we know, Singapore is an upper middle income country with a very strong health system, and their COVID-19 protocol are quite advanced, and always they react quickly. We also know from health data that Singapore's application of the recent advances in medical science is actually quite ahead for the rest of the region, and that's actually what the main reason why Singapore is it doesn't gain much from improvement in investment, because they're already quite developed. Whereas countries that are much lagging behind, which do not use the most recent advances in medical health, actually gains more in terms of increased health spending.
Okay. Ramesh, would you like to add anything, or will I move on to the next question?
No, nothing particular on the Singapore question, Jam. I think what James covered is adequate. I think what I'll supplement that is the overall approach that we've adopted for this scenario analysis. What from Singapore experience we can draw for other countries, and I think we would also add Philippines, which is now introduced universal healthcare reforms. That increase in healthcare spending does have a very clear, defined, positive impact. Obviously, it's going to be a policy challenge. Are you going to find more resources to introduce universal healthcare, or are you going to be looking at other economic recovery priorities? That's going to be a dilemma that policymakers will face in the coming months.
Thank you, Ramesh. The second question is from Liang Lei of Eco Business. How big will the impact of climate change be on Southeast Asia's economic recovery? And how much should Southeast Asia contribute to global climate mitigation efforts, given its uncertain economic outlook?
What I'd say is that, how much should Southeast Asia contribute obviously depends on, it's a question of finance, money that would be available, particularly as fiscal consolidation will be starting, and also what aspirations countries have. Now, if you look at the NDC submissions of plans that all countries have come up with and the announcements that were made at COP26, many countries have unveiled ambitious plans. So clearly, on the fiscal front, more resources need to be provided. But NDC is not just a public sector construct. Private sector needs to come together, and there needs to be a lot more private sector financing coming in. So our focus at ADB has been to mobilize our official development assistance, as well as to bring or leverage considerable private financing into the climate change space. So if you look at some of the specific initiatives, for example, that ADB has put in place, the energy transition mechanism, which President Mausa mentioned in his opening, holds significant potential. And we also believe that many countries as part of the NDC submissions as well as what they have in their economic recovery programs. They've got very interesting, innovative climate change type of projects, which if the projects become bankable, if more resources come in, clearly the contribution of Southeast Asia for GHG reductions would be quite significant. So we are working on some scenarios and based on modeling work. It's going to take some time. We are building in all the numbers, the facts and figures that have been embedded into the NDC. Jan.
Thank you, Ramesh. James, would you like to add anything else?
Maybe I would link the question to the risk coming from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With elevated energy prices, I think the agenda for shifting to greener economy will actually give more economic growth to the region, because it is now more affordable to shift to greener source or renewable energy because of these high energy prices, and we expect that these prices will not go down anytime soon, because most likely the economic sanctions will stay. So therefore, I think the economic return of investing in green economy and investing in renewable energies has become higher with this crisis.
Thanks, James. Since you mentioned Ukraine, the third question is related to it. This is from Alison Jackson of Agence France Presse. Do you plan to revise your projections to take into account the impact of the Ukraine war? How big an impact do you expect to see from the war in terms of growth, inflation, and unemployment? And which countries will be most affected?
James, you want to go ahead? I've already posted a brief response to that. We will be revising our projections. They'll be coming out as part of our Asian Development Outlook. Growth, we do not see a big impact because the direct impact, this is talking about Southeast Asia. Some of the other regions, for example, the Caucasus and Central Asian republics probably may be more affected in comparison to Southeast Asia. But in Southeast Asia, direct output impact probably and hopefully will be manageable. There will be a decline, but we think it'll be relatively small. Inflation, obviously, with oil prices going up, the impact will be there. But I think the challenge is going to be, what does the medium term hold? Is this going to threaten the nascent recovery from the pandemic and all the fiscal challenges countries will face? And how can we make sure that any knock-on effects don't become serious in the case of Southeast Asia? But James may want to add more.
Thank you, Ramesh. The only thing that I will add, Jam, is I think based on economic analysis that is out there, the global impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for this year seems to be a bit modest. The numbers that I've been seeing in different studies out there ranges from 0.2 to 0.5 percentage point of global growth. So of course that will actually have spillover effect on Southeast Asia, but that won't be large. I think the bigger impact is actually what Ramesh mentioned in terms of inflationary impact, because the multiplier of oil price to inflation is about 0.4, which means that for every 10% increase in oil price, right, you will have about 0.04. You will have about a 0.4% increase in inflation. So if for example in the Philippines, I think oil prices may have already reached 30%. If you use that multiplier, inflationary expectation, inflation could actually increase by 1.2 percentage point. But of course, this is a static analysis because there will be adjustment in terms of probably tax adjustment for oil. And then the second is some countries also provide subsidies to electricity, which will also temper the impact of oil. So I think we are still doing the analysis in the ADO, as Ramesh mentioned, and that analysis will come out in April 6th. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh and James. This next question is from Annabeth Lowe from the Business Times. The report states that Cambodia's GDP could be permanently lower than it would have been if the pandemic had not occurred. Besides carrying the chapters on Indonesia and in the Philippines, to what extent will the other ASEAN economies be permanently damaged by the pandemic, and why? How much damage is due to tourism disruption? And how will the tourism disruption affect economies beside Thailand and Laos?
for Cambodia, that's true. The economic impact of the pandemic on Cambodia is quite severe when you look at 2020 and in 2021, because Cambodia is growing at a very fast rate. The last 10-year average growth rate is about 7%. In 2021, I think Cambodia was expected to grow at 3%. So that's still, while it's positive growth, it's still way behind the potential growth trajectory of Cambodia. And even for the 2022 forecast, they're still much way behind. But as I said, the Cambodia is shifting its growth driver. One is improved contribution of agriculture, and then the second is stronger contribution of non-manufacturing production, like for example bicycle, electronic parts, as well as investment flowing into petrochemical industries, as well as solar panel industries. So I think there's still good hope that Cambodia, while it will not immediately go back to its pre-pandemic trend, will still post quite a respectable growth in the next 2 years.
Thank you very much, James. There are a few more questions, but unfortunately, we're running out of time. So this is it for now for the Q&A. Thank you to you both, and thanks very much to the media for sending in your questions. If some of your questions were not answered, you may reach out to ADB's media contacts in the news release that went out earlier, which you can find on ADB's website, adb.org. You can also find the full report on adb.org, and the link and the QR code are on the activity feed of the SEADS platform. Thank you everyone for attending the presentation and the Q&A. We encourage you all to remain for a short fireside chat with Ramesh and Akane Okotsu of Nikkei Asia, where there will be more insights about the report and the economic outlook for Southeast Asia. Over to you, Ramesh and Akane.
Right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to ask some more questions about the recovery prospect in Southeast Asia. So currently, I think the war in Ukraine is affecting all economies in some ways. There was a related question earlier, but could you elaborate a little bit more on how this, or including the secondary impact like inflation, how could it affect the scenario and policies needed for the recovery in Southeast Asia?
Thank you so much, Akane. Just building on what we discussed in the previous segment, for Southeast Asia, we don't think growth impact is going to be that high or that negative, fortunately, but there are downside risks that we need to closely monitor. Before I go into some of the details, I just wanted to say from ADB's point of view, as I think all of you would know, promoting regional cooperation and promoting peace and stability between countries, promoting partnerships, these are all things that are in our DNA. And in that context, we are deeply concerned about the Russian invasion. Obviously, for what it means to the region, what it means to the world. For us, kind of closer to ADB's member countries, the countries in the Southern Caucasus and Central Asia probably will be feeling the direct impact of what is happening there. In Southeast Asia, as we highlighted, what James and I mentioned, the direct growth impact of, probably going to be quite modest, but we are working frantically on our scenario analysis. Inflationary impact would be definitely there, unavoidable for many countries in Southeast Asia. Some countries will benefit from the increasing commodity prices as well as oil prices, but others are not going to. So we will see a generalized impact uptick in inflation. And obviously, with the global tightening of interest rates, what this would mean is that going to have an impact further on, pressures on interest rates. What does that mean for the nascent recovery? These are factors that we need to focus on. But what we are actually concerned is more the medium-term effects of the Russian invasion. Question is recovery going to be slow or slower? And second, related to this, is global aggregate demand going to be lower, and as a result, the demand that faces Southeast Asian countries for their export product going to be lower, because all of us have been pinning for recovery to be predicated on exports to revive. Like, there was this question on Cambodia. Cambodia has actually done really well in diversifying away from the GTF, the government textiles and footwear sector, into higher value manufacturing. Question is, for Cambodia as well as other countries, could that recovery stay on? Could demand stay high? And the third is a related issue that we are all concerned about is investments. To what extent regional and global investments are they likely to be affected because of the Russian invasion? So these are the things that we are looking at. On what you asked or what you mentioned, Akane, in terms of what can be done, I think I would say is to play up or amplify the positives and lower the negatives. Now, what are the positives? Clearly, countries are still kind of reading in the last stages of the pandemic. Vaccination progress, vaccination rollout needs to continue. Now, this is obviously would have been the case even without the Russian invasion, but it becomes even more important to boost domestic confidence. Diversify economies with more manufacturing happening, because we've seen tourism dependence, obviously, is not going to be undone. Countries will be dependent on tourism, but it's going to take time. So what can countries do in the meantime, say within the next 2 to 3 years, to boost, promote manufacturing, diversify? That's going to be critical. Third is digital capacity. It's not a short-term thing, but countries have done well in the last 2 years. What can be done to shore up digital capacity is going to be a priority area. On the kind of not so, the positive side, we all need to watch out for new COVID variants, increasing trade costs that were there before, which we need to address, and we need to be watching out for supply chain disruptions to make sure that they don't become, even more prominent, even more pronounced because of the Russian invasion. The weaker external demand that I mentioned, we certainly need to be watching, and inflation risks. And the last point, which is probably specific to Southeast Asia, is the unfortunate, concern about unfortunate recurrence of natural disasters. We're always keeping fingers crossed and hoping, praying that the region will not face any typhoons or other devastating earthquakes and so on. So that's something countries do need to be investing in disaster resilience. Let me pause there, Apane.
Thank you. And due to the current Russia-Ukraine situation, there are renewed discussions on energy security, and some see as a case for more investment in fossil fuel projects. How can countries in Southeast Asia build back greener while also ensuring energy security?
I'll say 3 things, Akane. One is go green, second is go blue, and third is go higher technology. Now, what do we mean by this? And it's not meant in a flippant manner. Going green is going to be quite critical. Climate change has always been a source of concern prior to the pandemic. Many of the important sustainable development goals that are linked to climate change, there were concerns that those SDGs may not be met, even in the no COVID scenario. COVID has certainly threatened. So going green is very critical. Now, going blue is particularly critical for many of the Southeast Asian economies that are ocean-dependent economies. If you look at from a food security point of view, fish stock is very critical, making sure that the pollution, increase in pollution that was there before the pandemic and now it's going to return. How do we contain ocean pollution becomes very critical. And the third, investing in technology, because on the energy security point that you mentioned, renewable costs are declining. What can countries do to invest? Now, this is global investments in new technology solutions, things like solar energy storage, carbon capture, and so on. There is a lot of merit in expanding and scaling up investments in technology. So that's why I said go green, go blue, go technology. Now, what is ADB doing briefly? We have launched in Southeast Asia. We've launched a number of new initiatives. We have the ASEAN Catalytic Green Facility, and building on that, we've launched a green recovery platform, which we call the 10X platform. Augmenting the 660 million in seed capital that we have. Aim is to scale it up at least to $7 billion in Southeast Asia. Second, we have set up a blue hub focused on ocean-dependent economies to help them deal with ocean pollution. Third is the asset regeneration platform, which is a partnership between ADB and particularly our public and private sectors working very closely together with Temasek Holdings of Singapore and HSBC, which Minister Indrani mentioned this morning. And then finally, the energy transition mechanism, which President Massa mentioned. We are focusing on Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. So these are, I think, initiatives that we believe would be helping the region deal with the energy security dimensions that are emerging, while at the same time also deal with climate change upon it. I'll pause.
Okay, thank you. The newly launched report talks about the widening inequality and the need for inclusive recovery. Can the post-COVID-19 recovery create more opportunities for women, the youth, and other vulnerable groups who are generally harder hit by the pandemic? And also, could you talk a bit about what ADB is doing about this?
Sure, Akane. This is, I guess, this is where I mentioned at the beginning, one gets emotional when you look at the numbers of the pandemic. The chart that James presented in terms of increase in extreme poverty, and unfortunately, the persistence in that increase, that is worrisome. Unemployment, job loss is worrisome. Now, what is even more worrisome is that the share of women is very high in these numbers that you see. And clearly ensuring that there are a lot more opportunities in the post-pandemic era for women becomes very, very important. In the previous panel that we had, all the speakers talked about this, particularly the CARE Secretary General, our VP, Governor Jokno, and the MasterCard EVP. All of them touched in their respective arenas, what are we doing? Now, for ADB, just to mention a few things upon it, one is gender mainstreaming has always been very, very critical. Just to put in a plug, actually, after this, there is a panel focused on women's role in sustainable development. Minister for Women's Affairs from Cambodia will be participating. Please do listen into the discussions. Gender mainstreaming, super critical. Now, focus on social protection is going to be very important, and which we've been doing for the past 2 years. Well, actually, in some countries in Southeast Asia for the past about, say, 10 years or so, become very critical in the last 2 years. Focus on youth, super, super important. And in this context, and by the way, this is both men and women, but particularly we are looking at how we can promote more gender equality when it comes to youth employment and youth opportunities. Two programs that we are particularly proud of, both have their origins in the Philippines, but learning from Philippines, we are now expanding to other countries. The first is Job Start program, which was launched several years ago, which has become quite successful, which we are replicating in other countries. And the second is the need to focus a lot more on school to work transition. This had been a priority before the pandemic. It's going to be even more so now, particularly because if the skills that people are investing in are not the skills that are demanded, then the gap between school and work would become longer. What do we do? How can we help them reinvest in different skills? How can we help them get into job market sooner, or things that we need to focus on? And here the report picks up some aspects and some of the other studies that we've done focus on the gender dimensions of the challenges that we are facing. But I think at the same time, with efforts that we made and other development, countries first and foremost, but also other development partners of ADB that we are working on with would certainly be contributing. And finally, I think there are dedicated investments that are focused on sustainable development goals, which would also have a positive effect. I can mention scores of projects on education, universal healthcare, priority area for many countries and hence for ADB. Finally, we have dedicated SDG financing platforms. Indonesia, we have a facility called SDG 1 Indonesia, which will be financing a number of green climate change projects, which all have significant elements of gender mainstreaming. I'll pause there, Pani.
Okay, thank you very much. And as you mentioned in the very beginning that the manufacturing sector and a resilient supply chain is critical, especially when we face more uncertainties. So could you, what do you think are one or two concrete changes that the region can make to the supply chain to be more resilient, cooperative, or prepared for the future?
Drawing on the approach that I adopted for the first question, what are the positive things that we can focus on? What are the negative things that we can kind of, reduce? I think we could adopt a similar approach when it comes to dealing with supply chain disruptions. I think on the on the negative side, at the beginning of the pandemic and at the height of the pandemic, there were policy-induced distortions. For example, countries imposed restrictions on trade, but luckily they all got addressed and they all got eliminated within a very short span of time. The economic ministers, trade ministers, finance ministers came together, and some of those early stage restrictions got lifted pretty soon. So we need to make sure that either if the recovery turns out to be low, or because the Russian invasion impact turns out to be more serious, regardless of what happens, I think countries do need to adopt open approaches with when it comes to trade in goods, as well as investment opportunities. Of course, all countries will be thinking regionally, but they need to act locally. So it's a balance that they need to adopt. But we hope that with the lessons learned, there will be more focus on more openness. Now, in terms of the things that can be done, I think clearly the region has seen considerable benefits from deeper penetration in regional and global value chains. Just one look at what the Greater Mekong sub-region has achieved. You don't need to go back to 1992 when the program started. You can look at chunks of 5 years. The increase in trade and investment that the region has witnessed has been enormous, and that's because of the participation in regional and global value chains. You can talk about any groupings of commodities. The GVC benefits are very, very clear. Now, three things that come to mind: what can countries do? Number one, improve further on trade facilitation. The region has been doing well. Non-tariff barriers have been eliminated, but there is always more that you can do on trade facilitation in general. Second is to invest more in digital means of trade facilitation and trade promotion. I think clearly there is a lot of opportunities. I think the points that James mentioned in his presentation on what we are seeing in retail, wholesale, commerce, how digitization has helped. I think, if you're expanding to regional commerce, what can be done? Clearly, there are benefits here. And finally, the third one is probably more medium term. That is the need to increase investments in logistics. This is going to be very critical: trade logistics, other logistics. Now, here I want to particularly reinforce what Singapore Minister Indrani mentioned. Logistics investments are very critical. Now, as you do it, make sure that those investments are green. So it's meeting two objectives. So we strongly and particularly support that. And again, to underscore on digitization, while it'll be not without costs, but I think there are significant trade and transport benefits through increasing digitization, and a whole vast swath of small and medium-sized enterprises could benefit from this, and it'll also help them boost their competitiveness and enhance their participation in international trade. I'll pause there, Connie.
All right, that was a very insightful chat. Thank you very much, Ramesh and Akane. And thank you everyone who joined us today. We hope this session has been useful for you all, and have a good rest of the day.